I have with me Chair Sylvia Luke of the Finance Committee, as well as Speaker Saiki, to talk about, very briefly, anything and everything about the legislative session. Sylvia, any thoughts on what we did for natural resources?
So, one of the things that we did was really taking a look at how we can transition from just the straight out tourism industry to a place where tourists are appreciative of our natural resources and our natural heritage. I think for the most part, a lot of people agree that pre-pandemic we were at 10 million tourists, and a lot of people agree that we don't want to go back to a place where we have 10 million plus tourists on a yearly basis. I think a lot of legislators know that even if we continue to have more and more tourists, the amount that they spend in Hawaii has not kept up with the number. So we try to transition to the type of tourists we want to bring to Hawaii. So one of the several things that we did was we had a parks management. During the Great Flood on Kauai a few years ago, one of the things that happened was the Hyena Park was completely shut down because of mudslides. And after that, the state took a step back and said, okay, let's take an opportunity to re-envision how parks will look like. So instead of having Hyena be overrun with just cars and tourists and even a lot of activity, and people would just park alongside the road and grassy areas and really clog up that entire portion. And when we took a step back, and thanks in part because the entire road was shut down, we looked at working with the community. They developed a system where the only way that you could get in is through a reservation and through a shuttle system. They put paved parking and you charge for parking. And so it was really a stewardship of that area because you limited the number of people coming in. And after that was established, thanks to the efforts of the DNR, even the local community who have not gone to that the North Shore of Kauai was really surprised, and they wanted to go back, and they brought families back, and it was limited access. We're envisioning something like that for all the parks around the state. Look at Diamond Head. I mean, the number of people who go to Diamond Head, or even Iao Valley. So we're doing working with DNR, kind of a master plan and how we can re-envision parks.
This pandemic really put a pause on our travel. We saw tourism just drop, but then it was a relief for so many of us, I think, as residents. And I know, Speaker, you're supportive of efforts like this kind of managed tourism, dynamic pricing. Any thoughts for you on how we're going to bring back tourism both sustainably and safely?
Yeah, so obviously I think during the pandemic, because the tourist numbers were down, Hawaii residents saw more of our state. They saw more of the natural resources, and I think have a greater appreciation for what's out there. So one of the approaches that we took this session, which I totally agree with, is to assess more fees on tourists. And my feeling is that people who want to visit Hawaii should be asked to pay more because they use the natural resources and the infrastructure here just like everybody else who is paying for that. So the legislature approved a county hotel room tax, a fee on rental cars, and authorized the Department of Land and Natural Resources to impose fees at state parks. So I think that's going to help set a really good a base for us to collect more revenue from tourists to pay for their uses here.
So clearly I agree with that, but Chair Luke, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's going to be really one of the big stories that comes out of this legislative session, about how we're kind of restructuring the way we handle tourism. If you could give some background on the Hawaii Tourism Authority and the transition, empowering the counties to impose their own TAT.
Right. So it really is an effort to shift the burden from residents and taxing residents as compared to it's an effort to bring in more tax dollar from tourists. So before we go to HTA, one of the things that speaker brought up is the rental car surcharge. Rental car surcharge, the amount that is generated from the rental car surcharge goes to the highway fund. The way that we fund highway fund is through gas tax. And so as opposed to increasing the gas tax and putting a lot of burden on our leeward residents or people who have to travel across Saddle Road from Hilo to Kona, as opposed to putting the burden on them, we thought, okay, the better way to do is put a surcharge on rental cars. So it's really shifting that burden from residents to tourists. For Hawaii Tourism Authority, for us to envision how tourism will be, it's really in trying to work closer with the Hawaii Tourism Authority and the industry to see what is the tourism industry will look like, not just in the next several years, but in the next 10, 20, 30 years, or even beyond. So one of the things that we did was we took the function of tourism marketing away from Hawaii Tourism Authority, and we embedded that into the research arm of DBED, so that we can, as policymakers, we can make a determination of what kind of research and what kind of fact base can help us envision how the tourism industry will look like in the next several years.
Speaker, any thoughts for you on how we're empowering the counties to maybe take on some more of the burden and actually take care of their own needs through their county TAT?
Yeah, so this is actually an opportunity for the counties to step up to the plate, because for years we have heard all of the counties demand more resources so that they can manage their islands and the tourism impact that they see there. So this is their opportunity now to make those changes.
So I really think that it was really important that we restructured government in this legislative session. Chair Luke, you're at the center of so many of these things. So just for you, maybe what are the top 2 bills that you think are really critical for this session?
So when we first started session and when we received the governor's budget, I think it was really shocking for many legislators and people in the community that because of the lack of revenues and lack of funding that resulted in the governor cutting many of the social service programs. I think one of the heartbreaking thing was the sex abuse treatment center had about $700,000 in cuts, which would have forced sex assault services being closed on nights and weekends. And I think I said this many times on the floor, that we cannot ask sex assault victims to come back on Monday at 8 a.m. and that would not be a conscionable thing to do. And even HIV services had about 64% cuts, which would have resulted in one of the 2 Kona offices to completely shut down. And even TB assistance and services had devastating cuts to a point where Department of Health had to fire a bunch of people, or potentially fire a bunch of people, which would have resulted in 30% more cases of TB in the state of Hawaii. I think one of the things that did not get a lot of attention and highlight is domestic violence services. Apparently, the Trump administration cut what's known as help for domestic violence victims and other victim services, from 10 million to 2 million. Clearly, the state was not in a position to restore many of those things, and I think the current administration is trying to look at restoring that. But the state of Hawaii, we through our budget, we actually restored close to $1 million in domestic violence services. During this time, mental health has been a big issue, and I think one of the things that we saw was a lot of the kids, because they weren't going to schools, the teachers could not identify if there were child abuse cases, and to be stuck at home with violent spouse is not a good situation, and we saw uptake in domestic violence cases, and we didn't want lack of funding to lead to lack of treatment. So those were the things that, these are the individuals who may not have individuals coming and lobbying for them and talking to us, but I mean, these were the individuals that I think all of us, speaker, majority leader, and myself, we sought out to the social service programs and said, okay, what are some of the ways that you're being impacted? And I'm very proud that we were able to restore many of these very important programs.
So there was a sea change during the legislative session where we were able to restore many of these programs because of the federal infusion of funds that came in. But I know that there's a lot of hooks that come with the federal funds. Can you share with our viewers what some of those challenges are and what the things that we're going to have to be looking out to in the future because of these federal funds?
Right. So in addition to the amount that the state receive, Department of Education and University of Hawaii receive additional separate funds, but there is a catch in the receipt of those funds. If they were to receive the funds, we would have to maintain the level of funding for Department of Education and UH at the same level, proportionately pre-COVID. And that put challenges because it came at the expense of social service programs and Department of Health programs.
So maybe what some people don't understand is that even though there were federal funds, we still had to do targeted cuts, and that you really kind of did look closely at the budget.
Right. And one of the things that we did much more aggressively this year was we did look at all the unused funding from the hundreds of special funds that the state has. And this year, in working in cooperation with the departments, we were able to scoop about $100 million of unspent special funds, and we eliminated a lot of special funds as well. And I think that will lead to better accountability and transparency for the citizens.
So a lot of balancing things. It wasn't just that the federal funds came in. We really had to look at special funds, vacancies, and look at the requirements. So, Speaker, this is your one opportunity. We've got 2 more minutes, and we're here with Representative Luke. What are your thoughts on all the work that her finance committee had to put in, and what maybe we're going to have to do in the coming years around the budget? Because I imagine it's still going to be a challenge for us.
Yeah, the Federal Rescue Act funds are great, and we were so fortunate to have received all those funds. But those funds are basically a one-time appropriation to Hawaii, and we're going to have to start planning for what happens when those funds are used. What kind of position are we going to be in? Will our state be in going forward, and how do we make up for the loss, for the spending down of those funds? So there'll be a lot of work, but I know Sylvia's up to the task, so I'm not too worried. You can't see
him smiling behind his mask. Yeah. Sylvia, Chair Luke, any thoughts on us moving forward into next session, and anything maybe fun you might want to share about your friend sitting across from you?
Well, I have known Scott Saiki since we were, in our mid-20s, so that was maybe 30 years ago. And he had a lot more hair and black hair, but clearly this job is not an easy job for him because he really aged. But I always say he's always an old man in his young man's body, so personality-wise, he hasn't changed.
Was that recorded?
It's all live. So what I would share with both of you is watching you both at work. I really appreciate Sylvia, how you kind of manage this budget in this state and look at all the different ways that we can be innovative. Speaker, you've been very, I think, empowering of your chairs, and I think we only have maybe a minute or two left, but I know that we had chairs this session who did some tremendous work. Anything you want to share, any highlights for yourself? It's hard to pick one or two, but I know that we had chairs in the resources, water and land, clean energy, doing a lot of work. The housing committee,
corrections. Also on the economic side, Housing Committee has a bill that creates a mediation program for people who are facing, renters who are facing evictions. That was a big deal. And then in our Consumer Protection Committee, Representative Aaron Johansson worked on a bill to reform predatory payday loan programs in Hawaii. So it's Representative Nadine Nakamura, Representative Troy Hashimoto on the housing side, Representative Johansson, and Representative Lisa Kitagawa on the payday side.
Chair Luke, any other bills that you want to highlight before we let you go?
Yeah, so David Tarnas, who is our Big Island chair, who chairs the Water Land Committee, he did a terrific job in consolidating Land Use Commission, Office of Planning, and OEQC into a new department called Office of Planning and Sustainable Development. And that's what we really need, right? Pulling together different resources and pulling together, breaking down silos between agencies and working on sustainable development. So we're very proud of the work of David Tarnas.
I'm looking forward to next session because I think we're only going to continue the work. But